Today we are installing the Dobinsons MRR kit for the 6th generation Bronco. Having had experience with this kit in the past, I was very eager to get it on and test it out. So I pointed the Bronco south and made my way to Automotive Outfitters Tire Pros in Portland to install my dream lift kit. I'm here at Automotive Outfitters Tire Pros in Portland, Oregon, and we are putting the MRR kit on the Bronco. So a fan of the channel actually owns this shop, and he invited me to come down and get some work done. And that was mid-install of the IMS kit, which was a bit of a pain because of all the stuff that happened with it. So I took him up on it immediately. I spent a little bit of time at the shop. I want to show you guys what all they do because they're a unique shop, but we'll get into that a little later. I also wanted to give a huge shout out to the guys over at Trail Bronco real quick. Brennan and Conrad, they were instrumental in getting this whole deal with Dobinsons set up. So thank you guys so much. If you're interested in any sort of installation articles or reviews or stuff about the Bronco, Trail Bronco is definitely the place to be. Have quite a few riders on Trail Bronco, me being one of them, and we try and post pretty consistently. So it's a good spot for just general knowledge of the Bronco. With all that said, let's get into the install. These are the Dobinsons MRR 3-way adjustable shocks. They allow for you to adjust for low and high speed compression as well as rebound. These ones in particular are set up for the added weight that I carry on my trips. But first thing we need to do to get these installed is get the Bronco in the air and get the tires off. One of the things we're doing today is replacing the stock lower trailing arms with adjustable trailing arms from Dobinsons. In order to do that, you have to drop the gas tank out of the way. With the rear axle supported, go ahead and remove the nut and bolt holding the trailing arm to the axle and then to the frame. We will measure the OEM trailing arms to give us a starting point for the new Dobinsons arms, but those will be adjusted later when we go to align the vehicle. Using the OEM hardware, install the new Dobinsons adjustable trailing arms in the exact place you took the old ones out. Lift the gas tank back into place, and now we can start working on the shocks themselves, starting with removing the fender liner. The fender liner is held in by 3 7mm screws, 2 thumb screws, and mini clips. So remove all of those, and then you can pull the liner out. So in order to get to some of these, we actually have to bend this out of the way just a little bit. So I'm gonna take a mallet and just There are 3 15mm bolts on the strut tower mount. Loosen all of them, but keep at least one on there, just thumb tight. From there, you can remove the lower shock mount, which is a 27mm bolt with a 30mm nut. And then while supporting the strut, remove the bolt that is holding it in place and drop it out of the strut tower. Before getting the MRRs in place, we have to install the remote reservoir mounts. You want to feed the hose clamps into these mounts before putting them on the frame, but there are 2 bolt holes directly behind the strut tower that these will mount to using the provided hardware that's in the kit. With the mounts installed, it's time to put the MRRs in place with the oil tube facing the rear of the Bronco. The top hat no longer has bolts in it, so you'll put that into the strut tower and feed the bolts down into the top hat. The remote reservoir is going to be mounted with a tube on the bottom of it and the connection facing the front of the Bronco. So feed that in and tighten down the hose clamps. For the lower shock mount, you'll reuse that 27mm bolt and 30mm nut, but be sure to install the provided spacers on either side of the bushing. With everything in place, go back through and tighten all the bolts down. You may have to lift the axle a little bit to get the top hat to seat correctly. Before we move on to the front of the Bronco, let me tell you about Automotive Outfitters Tire Pros.
While they started as a wheel and tire specialty shop, they have expanded over the years to have become the premier off-road shop in Portland. They do everything from window tint and wheel and tire packages to lift kits and full-on fabrication work. While they sell a ton of aftermarket parts for your rig, you are welcome to bring in parts that you bought elsewhere for install, something that is really hard to find in my area. With 4 lifts, a state-of-the-art alignment rack, and a separate bay for quick repairs, you won't be waiting long until you're back on the road. And the techs here are top-notch, so you can drive away with confidence in your rig. They are a 2-hour drive for me, but well worth it. So if you're looking to get some work done, definitely look at Automotive Outfitters Tire Pros in Portland, Oregon. All right, let's get these front struts installed. The installation of the front struts begins with the removal of 3 15mm bolts on the strut tower and 2 18mm bolts on the lower control arm. The techs here decided to keep the lower control arm in place, so they removed the upper control arm from the top of the steering knuckle and the axle nut to be able to pivot the knuckle out of the way. From here, we were able to use a pry bar to compress the spring ever so slightly to be able to remove it from the Bronco. If that's not something you want to take on, you can remove the 2 cam bolts holding the lower control arm onto the subframe. Be sure to mark the cam bolts before you loosen them so you can get them roughly in place to drive it to an alignment rack. Something I chose to do was install new tie rods. I chose the RPG tie rods because they are Heim joints and won't bind like a regular tie rod would. They do require drilling the steering knuckle, so I left this to the professionals. Now it's time to get the front struts in place. Neither the top hat or the lower shock mount has bolts in it anymore. So for the top, you'll feed your bolts down to the top hat and thread them in. And on the bottom, you will feed bolts up through the lower control arm and thread that into the lower shock mount. Something I forgot to film was the mounting of the front remote reservoirs. As with the rear, the kit comes with 2 mounting brackets. You'll feed the hose clamps through that before mounting it to the frame. On the frame, in front of the strut tower, you can see this little square cutout in the frame. Grab the correct mounting bracket, which are marked, and the U shape that's on the bracket will go underneath that square cutout in the frame. Bolt those into place, and you run the remote reservoir up from the bottom with the oil hose behind the upper control arm. The install is now done. Now it's time to button up the front end and get it to the alignment rack. You can see here Cody's checking the pinion angle. It needed some work, so he adjusted the lower trailing arms that we put on earlier to dial that angle in. With the back set, he could move on to aligning the front of the Bronco. I have had some time with the MRRs at this point, and they have not let me down. They seem much sportier than the IMS, keeping the Bronco flatter in the corners and more controlled under braking. But as soon as you take a harder hit or need that articulation, it is so floaty and compliant in those situations. I will be making a video soon talking about the differences between the IMS and the MRR and how I feel about each of them, but for now, I will just say that the MRRs are definitely staying on the Bronco. Until next time, I hope you're able to get off the grid and off the grind, and I'll see you in the next one.